Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to War Thunder. Um, yes, back here with War Thunder, more World War One. Got some new camouflages, such as this one, which is the Fokker E for the P-26s. They work on all of them. So, yeah, the .blk files were all there for all of them. So, yeah, now here's my excuse for playing the American planes, at least for now. And yeah, so these are them. They seem interesting. They have two 7.62 mm Brownings, so 2.30s. This one has a M2 machine gun somewhere mounted on it. Not too sure where. Not too sure where the guns actually are on this thing. I think I have no idea where the actual guns are for the P-26s, but yeah, they're on here somewhere apparently. Never really played the P-26s. I played one battle in them, I think. Started research towards the PBY-5 Catalina, but no, other than that, nothing. So, yeah, we're gonna hear War Thunder. Yeah, got some more people on call here. Not just me and the German guy. We got an American guy. We got a Russian guy. Then we got a Scottish guy, and all the normal people. But yeah, so now on ground strike. Kalkingol. Yes. But anyway, I was just going to talk about World War One because we're moving on. Just going to keep talking about World War One because of the new release of Battlefield One, and I'm going to move on to actual vehicle combat. Yeah, so this isn't exactly the Fokker E or the Fokker Eindecker, but it's the closest we'll get, and you know, it's nice that people have made these skins. But yeah, so moving on to ground combat. Um, Obviously, tanks didn't play a massive role really in World War One. They the first tanks were introduced by the British. Actually, 1917, because Sir Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, really wanted a way of supporting the infantry. Oh, well, there goes my wheels and my propeller. First Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Winston Churchill, wanted to support the infantry on the ground with some sort of armoured vehicle, and to keep it a secret from the Germans. Well, somebody rammed me. He decided to call the project Landships, and the first tank was the Little Willie. Don't laugh. Um, God, what a goddamn stupid name, you British have. You British have goddamn stupid names. I mean, come on. Is that the best thing you could come up with? I mean, it's not really appropriate for, I mean, you couldn't keep a straight face whilst you're, like, ordering that thing about. I mean, come on, it's like, what's your job, man? What you do? Oh, I work on the Little Willies. Yeah, they're good things. We're just, you know, working on the Little Willies, you know, driving them about, things like that. You couldn't keep a straight face. I mean, you would probably rather die than having to call in like goddamn tank support from those things. Yeah, well, luckily just for the name, really. They were not actually used. They were a very simple tank concept design. It was literally just a box with tracks, and they looked like water tanks, so they were named. So they were codenamed tanks to stop their real purpose from being revealed, and they were called land ships because, well, you know, they're ships of the land. You know, it's pretty self-explanatory. But yeah, so the British weren't really particularly interested in doing that. Oh, I have U.S. Navy underwings. Okay, that's breaking. Yeah. Oh dear. That's not a Fokker Eindecker anymore. That's U.S. Navy. But yeah. So apparently damage models don't stay. They don't have damage models yet, but still. So yeah, those tanks were not actually used. There's one in the Bovington Tank Museum, but that's like the only prototype ever made. after that, Mark 1 tanks were really the next big thing. Travelling at a whole 4 miles an hour, they could support the infantry over the rough trench ground. But the only problem with them was, well, really, the good bit about them was that they could act as support. They acted as basically mobile cover for the infantry as they advanced across the German-held trenches. They were slow, they were noisy, they were really rough to actually ride in. I mean, they could only go for a short distance before the crew had to bail out and actually throw up um, because of how actually bumpy these things were over the ground. They didn't have suspension, so every single bump over the you know just absolutely awfully like just disemboweled ground that's just covered in artillery pot marks, grenade explosions, just all of these craters just littering the battlefield meant that every single thing they ran over just echoes straight into the crew, and the seats were barely padded, so it really was a horrible thing. It was really noisy. They couldn't actually hear each other. They had to use a system of hand signals in order to actually communicate in the tank because there was no intercom at that point. So, of course, they had no way of communicating other than telling them thumping the gunner or whatever on the shoulder and telling him point at that thing and shoot it. So they had to actually use their feet and hands and actually, thumping people in order to get their attention along the bumpy ground. And they were really slow. They were barely bulletproof. The A7V was slightly better armoured with 30mm at the front, 20 at the side, and 10 at the top. But the Mark 5s, the British tanks were really barely armoured. They were barely bulletproof. The bullets could ricochet inside if they penetrated, so they were barely bulletproof. Plus, once the enemy had actually seen these things for a couple of times, they realised actually there are slits in these tanks that we can shoot through, and headshots happened among the tank crew, so they had to wear these really thick leather masks that would prevent splinters and bullets from actually travelling through and hitting these guys in the face because the enemy was shooting through the gun slits in order to actually do any real damage to these tanks. Plus, the British tanks were basically flat-topped, and an infantryman could easily throw a grenade onto the top of this tank and it would explode, and the shrapnel from the grenade would actually fly down into the tank, penetrate through the roof, and cause massive internal damage to the crew, modules, engine, guns, ammo, etc. So they had these basically sort of canvas screens over the top of over the top of the Mark 5, over the top of the male tanks. Well, over the top of the British tanks, in order to actually attempt to stop these enemy grenadier squads from throwing grenades onto the top of these tanks and killing people from inside. And so, yeah, they were just horrible. They were slow. They had a terrible power to weight ratio. They had massive engines. It was really cramped inside. They were barely armored, and they kept on upgrading them with better things, but the better things didn't really matter at all, really, because as they kept on upgrading, they originally had two different types of tanks. The British, they had the male versions of the tanks and the female versions of the tanks, which they both did different things. God damn it, you British don't learn, do you? You have these goddamn stupid names. I mean, the male and the female. I mean, that's just sexist, really. I mean, come on. I'm guessing here from what I know. The males were the ones with the big guns, and the females were the ones with the machine guns. So, I mean, that's just goddamn sexist. You're basically saying that the male tanks are the ones with the big guns because they can hit harder. I mean, come on, no, you British, you don't learn anything, do you? Well, I wasn't the one designing these names for these tanks. But yes, you are right. The male tanks had two 6-pounder guns mounted in side sponsons, and the female the female tanks had just machine guns littered everywhere to deal with infantry, and those were also mounted on side sponsons. And the thing about these side sponsons meant that they couldn't really shoot forwards. Only the starboard gun could actually shoot forwards at and engage enemies from the front. The left side sponson can actually shoot things to the side because, well, it just didn't have. Each gun in the sponsor could traverse 100 degrees. However, the thing about the sponsons is that they're not actually mounted centrally on the tank. They're obviously, side sponsons. They're on the side. They could be removed for easy rail transport. However, although it meant that they could engage targets at the side, it meant that they were very limited and actually pointed in the front of the tank to things where you'd think the most armor was, and actually engaging things from the front. And they originally used 6-pounders taken directly from the Navy, so they were long-barreled 6-pounder guns. However, the problem with it is that on a Navy warship, there's nothing to get these guns stuck in, stuck on, or stuck against. However, actually putting them in a tank, the long barrels meant that as they were going over these rough, pocket shell-hold grounds of no man's land, the gun barrels were just too long. They kept getting stuck in the mud. They kept on, clogging up. They were just awful things. So they basically just chopped the gun in half, and they just chopped off half the barrel and just said, there you go. It's now a shortened Hotchkiss version because that was just to differentiate it between the Navy version and the Army version. And so those were in the mail, so you had 2 of those, plus 3 machine guns, one mounted on the front of the tank, actually on the command sort of bridge bit. If you look at a World War I tank, you have the command bridge, and then also 2 mounted in the sides, facing outwards of the side sponsons, so that any infantry trying to sneak up from the side where the guns couldn't reach them would just get machine gunned down. And so that was the male version. The female version was just littered with machine guns. The side sponsons were kept the same, except you had 2 machine guns, one mounted where the 6-pounders would be, and then you basically mirrored that on the other side, the side sponson. Plus you had one in the rear, plus the same one in the front sort of bridge of the tank. And you can really see where the name Landship came from, because it's basically like a Navy warship, because you've got the bridge, you've got the guns, you've got the anti-whatever it is, machine guns. On a ship it would be anti-aircraft, on a tank it's anti-infantry. And they literally are just ships of the ground. So yeah, the females are just basically anti-infantry, the males are anti-fortification and later anti-tank, but then, yeah, the tank warfare was fairly limited. The Germans had 20 tanks. So, yeah, it was really limited. They first came into service and actually came into battle, the British tanks, in 1917, so only a year before the beginning of the war. And that meant that they really were just slightly too late to be of any proper real use. Well, I'd say that's a lie. I mean, they were useful. The infantry certainly loved them, because it just meant that they weren't getting machine gunned down by the machine guns as they did all of these massive offensives. But that's for a different episode when we actually talk about that. Yeah, it's. The tank combat really was limited, and right now I'm just talking about the British tanks and sort of going through each country. Because Britain has the most well-known tanks, then you've got the Germans with the A7V, then you've got the French with the Hotchkiss and the Schneider and the Char C2, and also there was one other one that I can't remember. But sort of Russia didn't have tanks as such. They barely had armoured cars as well. They basically had Lend-Lease, if anything. But the Germans only had... Well, we'll stick with the British. So we've covered basically the Mark IVs, and they wanted to upgrade to Mark Vs, but the Mark Vs weren't really, much used. They built about 1,200 Mark IV variant tanks, which is basically the same amount as Tigers that the Germans produced in the Second World War. So, yeah, that's just the Tigers that we're comparing them against. But yeah, they found that the Mark IVs were good at keeping up with the infantry. However, they wanted something a little bit faster because they didn't. They felt that 4 miles an hour just really wasn't enough for fast strike tanks. So they wanted something that could travel slightly faster than that. So they came up with the Whippet Mark 1A, and the thing about this is that they doubled the speed to a whole 8 miles an hour in order to do fast striking at the enemy lines before the big tanks arrived with all of the infantry to actually push home the offensive. So they were sort of like the cavalry tanks as such. So yeah, 8 miles per hour, very blisteringly fast. They were powered by 2 bus engines, one for each track, because there was no way of them diverting power from one engine to 2 different tracks. They had to have one for each, which meant that if you disable one engine, you disable one whole side of the tank. And if you look at the Whippet, on the Whippet you've got sort of like the sort of tent-looking thing at the very front of the tank. That is where the engines are, and just in front of that, where the sort of front point is, that's the fuel tank. So yeah, right at the front of the tank is that. Then you also have then you've basically got a control tower, basically, which could mount up to 4 machine guns. Which are mounted directly in the center of the of each side, each flat side of this Whippet, and it was 4 machine guns was a lot for that time. It was certainly very good at taking out infantry, and it was basically a cavalry tank as such. It would have been, so that's. Those were the 2 main British tanks. The Whippet was certainly a very useful tank, and the Mark IVs really did have their uses. Mark IV really was the definitive version of these British World War I tanks. And the reason I say... Well, we'll move on to the Germans, and the reason I say tank combat in World War I really was fairly limited was because the Germans only had 20 tanks built, and I think I'll let you take over for this, because you are, after all, from the country. Danke. Well, the Germans were not big on these tank designs. They saw how effective the British ones were, and once they wanted their own, so they started a sort of contest, a competition to see who could create the best tank, sort of. And so many designs were tested, but not many were chosen, and eventually there was one design that was chosen definitively. It was the A7V, and the thing about this is that it actually had the gun mounted frontally into the hull, which meant that it could actually engage targets to its front. Not only that, it was also coated in machine guns, 6 in all, on the flat side, well, there were slightly sloped sides of 20mm thick armor, and different to the homogenized steel that the British Mark IVs used. This armor was actually more effective at stopping a solid shot from actually getting through to the tank. So it was slightly more well armored, and it had only a single. It was sort of like an all-in-one tank. It had a single 57mm mounted frontally into the hull, and it also had on the side of the tank, on each side, they had 2 machine guns, 2 Maxim machine guns, and then on the back, slightly angled front of the rear of the tank, there were another 2 Maxim machine guns, and a whole 20 of these tanks were made, and the first combat took place very late into the war, between some Mark IVs and some Mark IV males and these A7Vs. And some of these A7Vs still survive, as do a lot of the Mark IVs, which really is quite an achievement. But yeah, only 20 were made. They bolstered it up to 20, but like the British tanks, they were sort of slightly too late to be of any real use. The Germans did not use them for any sort of offences. They were barely used because they were of such a limited number, which meant that the British sort of didn't get to see them much. Um, but yeah, that was really the only tanks that the Germans created. They had sort of Daimler-Benz armored cars. The British had their Rolls-Royce armored cars and their Austin armored cars, which they were basic armored cars. They were basically just taken from the civilian population, given some armor plating, and a machine gun mounted in a turret, and sent off to war. So, yeah, that was effective. And yeah, but the Germans weren't really big on the cars. They were sort of on the tanks. They were more sort of like defend and retaliate. They were, because they didn't really, I suppose, see the use in of armored combat. They were sort of just more infantry based, partly probably because of the Kaiser and how he did it. But yeah, the Germans did not. To think that a country that had 20 tanks in the First World War could go on to build something like the Tiger, the King Tiger, the Jagdtiger, is really quite impressive when you think about it, because, yeah, 20 terrible A7Vs transformed into 1,300 Tigers. That is quite an achievement. But, yeah, I think we are covered with the Germans now. There's not really much to say about that. Hey, now hold on, y'all. Before you all get, bogged down in saying, yeah, this is good, this is good, this is what this country did, this is what this country did. Where the hell's goddamn USA? We bailed out your butts in World War One, so where the hell are we, huh? We had our own tank designs. Pretty sure we had our Mark 8 Liberty tanks. I mean, come on. They're called the Liberty tanks. They must be American. Well, they're partly American. It was a Anglo-American design. Um, the Americans and British basically just worked together to make this super big tank, and it's basically a sort of stretched Mark 5 or Mark 4 male. It's really nothing special, barely any were made. Well, one other tank that the British did make was the Tadpole. And that really is just basically that really is just a humongously stretched Mark IV, and it was designed to cross the biggest trenches. But not only that, it was basically a Mark IV. So it had the two 6-pounders, it had the two it had the 3 machine guns, but not only that, it also had a mortar mounted at the rear, because what they did is they stretched the tracks, but they didn't stretch the body. So you've got this body with this massive stretch of track at the back. So they basically just mounted a platform and just placed a mortar there and just said, there you go, enjoy mortaring from the cover of a tank. But also the first World War tanks, like the Mark One, version of these British tanks, they also had like this little guide wheel, which was designed to help steering, but it was found that they always clogged up with mud. They just didn't really help with steering at all, and they were really just more of a hindrance than anything else to the actual tank. So those were got rid of very quickly. But yeah, so the British really were just full of fantastic designs, as you could tell. And the French also had they tried their hand at building tanks, and they came up with the first modern tank, as I'm sure you know, is the Renault FT-17, which is the Tier 1 French tank in World of Tanks. That is the first proper tank, so it was, to actually have a turret, a rotating turret. And there were 2 different types of them. It was basically the male/female mentality, but for the French. So instead of having side sponsons and having the 2 different weapons configurations in them, they instead just had, inside of the turret, they either had a 50mm machine gun, or well, just a Hotchkiss machine gun, or they would have a short-barreled, very short-barreled, 37mm gun, and those were the two different types. And yeah, they had this little scoop at the back to try and sort of cross trenches, but I don't actually know how useful they were. Then you also had the Saint Chamond, I think, was the sort of assault tank. It mounted a 75mm howitzer, which was big for those days, and it mounted that in the front of the hull, and it's a very funny looking thing. I'd love to have known, how it would have done coming up against an A7V or something, actually doing any sort of tank combat. But I think the idea was that it was just sort of like a breakthrough tank. It was fairly sloped at the front, and it had short tracks, and it obviously wasn't designed for crossing trenches, which is something that the A7V also wasn't designed for. Those short tracks and the sort of overstretching body over the end of these tracks sort of meant that they sort of couldn't cross trenches. But yeah, the Saint Germain was more sort of like a breakthrough tank. It had sloping frontal armor with a big 75, which would more than likely fire high explosive, and would just sort of take out pillboxes and whatever, the concrete pillboxes that the Germans built. But actually, coming onto tracks, the British male and female tanks, they sort of had the tracks running the span of the outside, so they were just one big exposed loop of track, which was very useful for actually crossing trenches, which is something that the A7V sort of lacked, because they had very short tracks. Well, the A7V had very short tracks, and also the tracks weren't really built with trench crossing in mind, because sort of the rest of the because the body of the A7V actually just sort of stuck out either side of the tracks, which meant that before the tracks even got anywhere close to actually getting stuck in the width of the trenches, it meant that the body would get stuck first. It would sort of just plop into the mud and sort of stick there, and the tracks would sort of just dig themselves into the ground. So, yeah, actually crossing trenches, as soon as you get to a trench, the A7V just fails horribly. And if the Mark IVs couldn't actually cross the trenches, then they had fascines, which were just massive bundles of wood that were just sort of held together by like rope, and they would just cut the rope holding it onto the tank, and just let it go, and it would drop into the trench, and then they could easily carry on their merry way, which would have been useful for things like the Whippets. So these Mark IVs would go in, they would drop the fascines, the Whippets would rush across and continue their assault, whilst these Mark IVs bring up the rear after dropping their fascines. So they were sort of like a multi-role thing. And yeah, the French had their own sort of Peugeot armoured cars as well, for that, for the armoured car purpose. Armoured cars really were a more common sight on the battlefield than tanks, because the idea of tanks was unheard of. As soon as the British did it, everyone was like, "Oh, that's a good idea. We're going to adopt that." And so now all of a sudden, everyone's building tank designs, but nobody's really getting them right. The British got the closest, but you could say that all three countries really that were major in building tanks were all sort of half there, but sort of half not. The A7V sort of had the armour for the time, and it also had the gun mounted frontally, but yet it was massively big. It had a massive crew of like 11 people, which all crammed inside this tank, built of that was basically a combination of infantrymen, artillerymen, and officers, I think, for actually controlling the tank, and all three of them sort of didn't always get along. So there were arguments inside the tank before you even actually get into combat with another enemy vehicle, and so they sort of had the armor and the forward-mounted gun, but yet they didn't actually have the purpose. The Mark IVs, they had the actually trench crossing ability, and they actually had purpose and use, and they were very useful in that regard. But yet they were slow, they were bulky, they had no suspension, they had terrible engines, terrible power to weight ratio, they were horrible to drive in, and yeah, it's just. And then the French with the Renault, it had the rotating turret and was the first modern sort of tank design, but yet it also had decent speed for the time, judging on a lot of tanks, but it sort of was too small to actually be of any use on the potholed sort of environment of no man's land. It couldn't really cross trenches again because it would often get stuck, even though they did have sort of like the scoop at the end. Or at the back of the tank, it was, yeah. So they all sort of had it there, but weren't quite sort of there yet. And so, yeah, just First World War was good in a lot of regards, sort of in as far as warfare is concerned. Um, yeah, they had all of these new designs, such as actually using planes for something other than reconnaissance. They sudden introduction of land ships. All of these fantastic new technologies were suddenly being used for warfare, and all of these things that people thought impossible were suddenly becoming life. They were taking birth, taking life, and yeah, they were sort of yeah. I think that sort of basically covered it. Anything else anyone wants to add? I can't think of a thing. There was that American skeleton tank, but I don't know if that was any use. There was also like a gas-powered tank, and an electric-powered tank, and then I think there was also a steam tank for America. But yeah, I suppose you're right. America wasn't really big on tanks. They didn't really have anything. Um, I think I think you could probably mention something about captured versions of these Mark IVs that the Germans used, because well, I suppose I could say it. Yeah, yeah, sure, go for it. Well, the A7V was well, it was a very limited supply, as you keep saying. It is only 20 were built, and many of these Mark IVs were captured, and so Butte stands for loot or booty. And so many of these were taken as trophies, coated with German paint, put on the crosses, and sometimes the British 6-pounders were taken away and fitted with the German equivalent, and they were then sort of sent out to battle. And after the war, some of these German tanks were used to quell riots and things, because the British were better at the tank design at that point. I will admit, and these Butte Panzers were more widely used. If the Germans needed an armored tank, then these Butte Panzers would be used because there were so many of them. The British, as you say, built over 1,000 of the various tank designs, and so obviously some of these would make their way to German hands, and so. We need tank support. Well, we have a supply of British tanks. We may as well use them. So the British would probably be more likely to fight against their own tanks than any sort of German design. So yeah, there's nothing much really to say on that. But you can find pictures of 1919 and things. Some of these captured Mark IVs sort of sitting around. And I think there was also a surviving Mark IV mount in some island somewhere that was kept as a training thing. And then in World War II, it was built up to strength. It was running, and the Home Guard used it in case of German invasion. It would obviously have been destroyed very easily, but yeah, that was just an odd thing to add. But I think we have basically covered everything about tank warfare in World War One. It was horrible, uncomfortable, noisy, terrible, not really of any use at all to anyone. They were slow, big targets, easily knocked out by artillery or something dropped from a plane, for example. Grenadier squads could easily just throw a grenade onto them. Yeah, they were just horrible things, the first tanks, but yeah, I think we've covered everything. Yes, so yeah, that was armored warfare in World War One. I suppose next we'll go on to I suppose infantry weapons, or just weapons in general. I suppose that would be interesting. Oh yeah, the MG-0815. Oh, that was a good machine gun. Yes, so I suppose next War Thunder episode is more sort of like World War One talk with War Thunder thrown in the background. But yeah, so next time we'll move on to the weapons The Weapons of War. That sounds like a good title. I'll remember that. So I'll thank you for watching, and goodbye.